Today we have a great guest on the program. He's someone who's a frequent guest on A Neighbor's Choice, and he joins me now to give us an update on a big project that he's got going on. He is the great Scott Horton. How you doing, Scott?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me, man. How are you?
Doing well. And of course, you can check him out at antiwar.com and Libertarian Institute, where you can find his and his team's work on a variety of matters of interest in the world today. And I wanted to get you on to give us an update. You've been doing your big project on the Ukraine situation, the history of American foreign policy in relationship to Russia and Ukraine. Is that right? Is that a fair description?
Yeah. Yeah. So you might remember a year ago, David, I did that 2-hour-long speech in Utah and published it as that long essay, The History Behind the Russia-Ukraine War. And then that was going to be a short little book that I was going to put right out. And then you know how I do, man. Chapter 2 became a whole book about Afghanistan. So this is, chapter 2 of my Middle East book became a whole book about Afghanistan. So I've gotten completely carried away now. And the book is almost 600 pages, and it'll be, I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess I'm going to keep writing it till I'm done. And then I'm going to cut as hard as it is. I'm going to cut it all down and probably save a bunch of those block quotes for later and stuff and try to get it back to reasonable, readable length for you guys. But it's
and all you're doing is you're trying to follow in the footsteps of the great someone like a Kamala Harris, who's done all of her research and
yeah, exactly right. Yeah,
you're just trying to keep up, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so you know what it is? It's really the same as I am about the Middle East in enough already, where I'm trying to tell you one through line story from Jimmy Carter all the way through and show how it is that they got us into this mess and made it all worse and that kind of thing. So in this case, we start with H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War and how they promised not to expand our NATO alliance east, but they didn't mean it. It was a promise that was made to be broken, and they were just biding their time till they could go ahead and do it anyway. And then after that, I mean, you could finish the sentence for me. After that came Bill Clinton and W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Joe Biden. You think the policy got any better during any of that time? The only one of them who wanted to make it better was Donald Trump, and they framed him for treason. And so he fell right in line on that. And or either that or he just didn't have any control over his, foreign policy in his Pentagon at all, from the way that they treated the Russians while he was in power. So essentially, look, to make it real simple for you, we all learned this in grade school, and it's pretty much correct, this part. At the end of World War I, Wilson, who helped tilt the balance so far in favor of the British and the French, was unable to restrain their lust for revenge against Germany. And they so humiliated the Germans that it helped lead to the rise of the Nazi Party and then World War II. And never mind that his intervention led to the rise of the Soviet Union in the East, but we'll put that one off for another time. But anyway, everybody knows that. The vindictive Treaty of Versailles led to World War II. John Maynard Keynes and everybody said it. Everybody knew it at the time that this is going to lead to another war. So then, as I was raised, I'm sure you were raised to understand and believe that after World War II, America got smart and we befriended at least the West Germans and the Japanese, and we rebuilt their countries and we made them our friends instead of sticking it to them and putting off the next chapter of the war till another time.
Yeah,
and
we were very nice to them.
Right. So just on the base level, just take it and like it. That's more or less true. Okay, there are other complicating factors, but fine. My point is, and the analogy is apt, that at the end of the Cold War, we went on the World War I model, where, Bill Clinton and his guys, H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, they pretended that they were being nice to the Russians and helping them back on their feet, but they really weren't. They were really doing much more of like the Versailles Treaty treatment in destroying their economy and, completely defanging them and running roughshod over all of their interests in a way that just led to revenge. Now, I'm not saying that Putin is Hitler. He's more like Hindenburg. We could do a lot worse, and there are a lot of powerful forces to the right of Vladimir Putin in Russia right now, very dangerous ones. But this is essentially what happened, right? Was instead of being a good sport like America, the baseball fan should be, instead, we're jerks about it. We were Bill Clinton about it and kicked them while they were down. And when they tried to overthrow Yeltsin in a free and fair election, America colluded and intervened with billions of dollars to make sure that Boris Yeltsin won in 1996, which just helped lead right to the rise of Vladimir Putin and his declaration of independence from the United States, at the end of the Clinton years, beginning of Bush, that the Americans are still not over. And that's what this is all about, David, is the Americans. And look, I'm from here. I don't care about Russia, and I don't care about China, and I don't care about the Ayatollah or anybody else. I'm a Texan. Okay, but the reality is our guys are the world empire. Our government is the dominant military and political force on this planet, and they push their luck. The same guy, Bill Clinton, that got us attacked on 9/11 by bombing Iraq from bases in Saudi Arabia for 8 years straight, is the same guy who pushed us into Eastern Europe, right into Russia's so-called grill, in a way that guaranteed the response. And of course, W. Bush quadrupled down and made it that much worse. We can go into details if you want, but he and then Obama, they all pursued the exact same policy of just making it worse and worse until it came to this point. It's not to excuse what the Russians have done, but it's sort of like if you go and shove somebody a bunch of times and then he stabs you, well, that's not necessarily a justified proportional reaction, but let's not pretend you didn't shove him, and that's what's going on here.
And going around their neighborhood and causing as much trouble and chaos around their borders as they could get away with, right?
That's right. I mean, everyone's heard of the color-coded revolutions. Well, who color-coded them? American public relations firms. That's who, right? The National Endowment for Democracy, the George Soros foundations, and they go and they overthrow in violent, sometimes peaceful coup d'etats, dressed up as revolutions. And they did it in Serbia in 2000, in Georgia in 2003, in Ukraine in 2004. They tried in Belarus and Lebanon in 2005, succeeded in Kyrgyzstan with the Tulip Revolution in 2005. They tried the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009. Remember that? They tried again with Belarus in the year 2020. And David, I got to tell you, if you have a map of Eastern Europe in your mind, or if people in your audience need to pull one up, Belarus is just right there between Russia and Poland.
Didn't
this
they try
is even more than Ukraine? This is their most important allied state as a buffer between them and their Western European antagonists of millennia going back. And so for the Americans to try in 2005 and again in 2020 to overthrow Belarus is no different, honestly, than if the Russians were trying to do a coup d'etat in Canada. And that's the same thing for Ukraine, too. It's absolutely intolerable to them. And it should be very easy for Americans to understand that. How would we react if the Russians were just, no matter how the Canadians voted, the Russians would just intervene again and again until they were able to overthrow the government and install their guys in power? We would go absolutely bananas in this country over that. I love this. You'll love this if you didn't hear it. The Parliament proposed a law that said if your NGO or media company gets more than 20% of your funding from foreign sources, you have to admit it and sign up based on the Foreign Agent Registration Act of 1938 in the United States of America that we have to this day, that every single person in Washington, D.C. is in violation of right now. But anyway, and then the Americans freaked out, and all the NGOs poured all their money into all these people, came out into the street to scream and protest. Mm-hmm. And they're in such a hurry, they didn't have a chance to spin it in any kind of sensical way, right? So they go, well, listen, if these people are deprived of their foreign-funded NGOs and media, well, that threatens their independence. And this is obviously a Russian law, and it's the Russians who want, at no point in any of the news stories, and I read them all, Reuters, Times, Post, and Wall Street Journal, and the rest, none of them even make an argument. None of them even pretend to draw a connection. It's like astrology. How do we know that this is at the behest of the Russians? We don't know. They just say that. This is what the Russians want, is a law that will limit the influence of these American NGOs there. But presumably it would limit the influence of Russian-backed NGOs and media sources in Georgia as well. But so they're just blatantly saying, look, a level playing field does not suit us. And then at the same time, they go, look, all the people of Georgia want is to be independent and free. And this compromises their aspiration to join the Western Bloc against Russia. And they just say it blatantly. We're trying to integrate them into the EU and into NATO eventually, and this could stand in the way of that. Well, what's that got to do with Georgian independence? from anybody but Russia. Sure doesn't sound like they got independence from America at all. It sounds like they're an American colony right now.
Yeah, it's so laughable if you're watching this with any kind of neutral attempt to try to ascertain the facts rather than just buying into the narrative of the media, which we have to say is deputized state media. I mean, they're not anything indistinguishable from that. I'm sure that they occasionally will report something negative about something the United States government does, but it's always at the behest of another agency or faction within the United States government that has got more pull in that media outlet or that editor than the other faction that's getting some negative coverage. So that's just the way it is. When you look at going back to the origins of this whole current era of American foreign policy towards Russia and that area, I'm reminded of the 1990 issue where James Baker said we're not going to go 1 inch eastward towards the Warsaw Pact countries to Mikhail Gorbachev. Now there's been a few years ago, the George Washington University released some archives called NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard, and it talks about declassified documents that show a security assurances against NATO expansion to Soviet leaders from Baker, Bush, Genscher, Kohl, Gates, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Heard, Major, and Warner. Did you look at those archives? Is there something that we should learn from?
Yes, I got a whole giant section at the risk of beating a dead horse because they lie about this and dispute it. And so I really, go to great pains, to great lengths to show what went on here. And the bottom line is that they did not sign a treaty that said, and we promise not to go east. They signed a treaty that said, well, we're going to reunite Germany and we promise not to move our forces beyond a certain quantity and quality into the east of the country and this and that. So the Hawks have a point there. However, the only reason the Russians agreed to that treaty was because of exactly what you just quoted. James Baker told them, look, if you sign this treaty, then we promise not to go or to allow, the reuniting of Germany, then we promise not to move 1 inch to the east. And they go, and you just read the long list of the different names. It wasn't just the Americans, but it was the Germans themselves, as well as the British and the French, and especially the Americans, that told them over and over and over again. So there are people like this lady, M.E. Surratt, who wrote this book where she goes, I don't know, it didn't really give them like an ironclad deal. However, like, it's undeniable that they only agreed to any of this in the context of that promise that James Baker said. And they said, and I'm sorry, I don't have all the exact quotes in front of me, but they said, the word any is in there. Like, any move to the east would be precluded here, and so that does include the rest of Eastern Europe and the rest. But it's important to note that they were lying, Dave. They knew. James Baker and Brent Scowcroft and H.W. Bush, their plan was they wanted to bring in Poland and Hungary and even the Baltic states when they could. And the Baltics are right on Russia's border too. And when we can get to that, we should and can. And the deal essentially was they were lying and stringing the Russians along, making them believe we were going to do this project called the Partnership for Peace, where Russia and Ukraine and even Kazakhstan, which is the most important of the Central Asian states to Russia, that they'll all join. We'll all be equal partners in the thing. They were saying privately to each other, yeah, right, pan-European security is a joke. We're not doing that. We're going to build up NATO. And they were telling the Russians, well, we're going to turn NATO into a political organization. And we're going to have this new Partnership for Peace is going to supplant it as the military security organization in Europe. And they were lying all along.
Why were they doing that?
Because they needed the Russians essentially to get out of the way in the short and medium term so they could, expand the NATO alliance, more completely.
Stand down. We're not going to do anything to harm you.
Right. And see, it's interesting too, David, that when the Bush senior people talked about this back 30 years ago, they would say things like, well, look, we're just talking about Eastern Europe. We're not talking about Ukraine or Belarus or something like that. We're only talking about Eastern Europe, right? Because Ukraine and Belarus, the Baltics, those are east of Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is, Poland, Hungary, maybe Romania, Bulgaria, but you're already pushing it. So even they talked about it like, come on, it's not like we're going to bring Ukraine in. Skip one, and his son is the president, and his son says, I'm determined to bring Ukraine in. And even though the CIA tried to stop him, his National Security Council tried to stop, tried to stop him. But W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice determined to do this. And over the Germans and the French and their objections, first of all, we get nothing out of this. Right now, Ukraine, it's a buffer border state. Why break their neutrality? Why force them to choose one way or the other in a way that's going to antagonize their neighbor on the other side? When we got essentially a perfectly stable relationship, and they have a perfectly stable relationship with both sides now, can't we just leave it at that? You know, this is a push too far. And, you know, Fiona Hill, who just speaks out of both sides of her mouth all the time, she took credit in the New York Times Magazine, at least at one point, for telling W. Bush, it's like the New York Times weekend magazine profile of Fiona Hill, and it begins with the whole scene as she tells W. Bush, don't do this. And Cheney gets mad and storms out, and she tells W, look, this is going to drive the Russians mad. They are not going to accept this. It could lead to like a violent conflict of some kind as they like move to prevent this from happening. And that's why the Germans and the French are against it. And then I believe her when she tells this story, because this sounds perfectly to me exactly what W. Bush would do. He completely changes the subject from Russia's concerns to Germany and France's concerns about Russia's concerns. And now he says, don't worry, I'll handle the Germans and the French. I like a good diplomatic challenge. So now we're not even talking about the Russians and whether they're going to go to war over this or not. Now we're talking about whether he can give Angela Merkel a back rub and make her go along with this, which of course didn't happen. And the Germans and the French, they didn't quite put their foot down because they can't, because America's the 800-ton gorilla. So instead, they forced a compromise. Well, we'll promise to bring Ukraine in one day, which I'm not saying it would have been better. Their argument is, would have been better to just go ahead and make them members that day, full-fledged, because then it's too late for the Russians to do anything about it without really picking a fight. Now, I think the Russians would have reacted anyway. I think there would have been a war anyway. But they do have a point when they say, this is just the worst of both worlds, because they're giving Putin all the reason in the world to try to break Ukraine up, to destabilize it, to do whatever he can to prevent Ukraine from ever being integrated into NATO. And so then you have this back and forth, this tussle back and forth. And then what does Obama do? Obama comes in and it's funny because John Kerry doesn't seem to be in this script very much. And I actually need to write that down and do a deeper dive on Kerry's role in 2014, because we know that Biden, the vice president, was involved, and we know that Victoria Nuland and the ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, were deeply involved in essentially another coup d'etat dressed up as a revolution in February of 2014, which led to the loss of Crimea and the breakout of war in the Donbass.
So let's be clear, America, by being involved in a coup in 2014 in Ukraine, declared war on Ukraine, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's the whole thing of it, isn't it? That people go, oh, Russia's violating their sovereign borders. Well, we're violating their sovereign borders when we do a coup d'etat.
That's an act of war, isn't it? Is that an act of war under international law to instigate a coup d'etat in another country? That's an act of war.
Hey, man, with any
so America declared war on Ukraine in 2014 then when they did a coup d'etat, right?
That's, I think,
let's make it clear.
Look, put the shoe on the other foot for a minute. David, look at how the Democrats absolutely had a nervous breakdown when Russia actually did not intervene in the election of 2016 at all. The whole thing was just made up. But they said it was worse than Kristallnacht, which was the inauguration of the Holocaust in Germany. They compared it to September 11th at Pearl Harbor, said Russia has attacked us and done a coup and overthrown the government of the United States of America. None of it was true at all, but they tore this country to pieces over it. We're still dealing with the consequences of it right now. And it was a panic attack over just a hoax by the Democratic Party and the secret police in the FBI's counterintelligence division and the CIA. Simple as that. As everyone listening to this knows, Donald Trump was never the Russian Manchurian candidate. It was all a lie. Sorry, it was all 1,000 lies.
So it's amazing how people can even process the torrent of lies you've just described there. One of the aspects that I want to see more from your work, and we will look for it. And I'll give it a cliffhanger now. Is the Clinton part of it, because that era gets misunderstood. I've talked to some folks who are generally kind of moderate on foreign policy hawkism, but they'll still say, "Oh no, America didn't really do anything that bad against Russia under Clinton and that whole era. That was just maybe some ruthless oligarchic capitalists that were exploiting, but you can't really put that as an American official, act or something there. But maybe
Sweet bliss of naivete, No, it was the American gangsters that came and set all that up. I mean, look, you know how responsibility is, man. It's a quality, not a quantity. So you can keep divvying it up however you like. But these oligarch gangster criminals in Russia, a lot of them, former KGB and whoever, a bunch of cutthroat gangster murderer criminals responsible for every action they take from the time they're 16 or whatever. Of course. Does that mean that Bill Clinton and Al Gore and Larry Summers and the Harvard boys are not responsible for their role in pushing the policies the way that they did, and picking and choosing winners the way that they did to make sure who was in charge, and to keeping Yeltsin in there, who was the guy who was allowing all these oligarchs to get away with what they did, and designing the economic policies that just absolutely bankrupted the country. I mean, if I say to you 25,000% inflation, you know what that means. That means that no private person in the country has any wealth denominated in currency anymore. All of it gone. All your savings gone. Anyone that had anything has to start over at nothing. And they did that to them over and over again, just hyperinflation after hyperinflation in the 1990s, and just completely gangsterized look, it had been a Marxist economy where literally the government, the national government, owned every factory, every bit of the means of production. And what they do, they just handed them all over to 7 guys who in many cases just liquidated whatever capital was there and just took it and ran off to Tel Aviv or New York City or London and just completely raped the country. Look, the excess death rate is somewhere between 3 and 6 million people. The excess death rate is in the millions of people from the fall of a Marxist economy. Once the American capitalists got their hands on it, because they didn't create a free market, constitutional, limited republic kind of thing. They kicked them while they were down. They beat them while they were down, is exactly what they did. And then on top of that, they supported not just wars against Serbia in the Bosnia intervention in 94, 95, and in Serbia, Kosovo in 1999, but they did it on behalf of the bin Ladenite terrorists. I mean, the guy who was the ringleader of the September 11th attack, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and the guys that crashed Flight 77 into the Pentagon, Midhar and Hazmi, they all earned their stripes fighting for Bill Clinton in Bosnia. That's who they were. They were bin Ladenite, Al-Qaeda terrorists, and Bill Clinton had us on their side. He did the same thing with the Kosovo Liberation Army in 99. So again, just straight up allies of Osama bin Laden, literal men who camped together with him, like his boys from the Afghan war, the Arab Afghan army, and they did the same thing in Chechnya. And you might recognize this from some statements by Putin lately. In his declaration of war, he brought this up. And he said, and in fact, I saw another quote of him recently where he framed it the same way. He said, "Come on, let's be adults about this," which I think is interesting because in a way, what he's saying is, this isn't conspiracy theory stuff. This is when you're really a grown up and you're really willing to understand how the world works and not be afraid of the real ugliness and horror of the truth of it. America and Britain backed bin Ladenite terrorists in Chechnya in 99 and 2000 against the Russians. And he says, you think we forgot that? And in my book, man, I prove it 100 ways to Sunday. It's in there, believe me. I mean, this is, in fact, that's part of the reason. You remember the famous story, everyone, remember the famous story of Zacharias Moussaoui, who wanted to learn how to fly a jumbo jet, but didn't care about how to take off or land. And he was studying Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the flight school employees turned him into the FBI. And the FBI got right on the case and started doing their job. But the bosses in Washington, D.C. would not let them have their Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant, wouldn't let them even go to the court to ask for one to search his computer. If they had, they would have been able to trace this man directly to the Al-Qaeda cell in Florida that were the ringleaders of the attack. They could have rolled up the September 11th attack in August of 2001 if the bosses in DC had allowed the people in Minneapolis to do their job. You'll remember that Colleen Rowley, the FBI whistleblower lawyer, was made Time Person of the Year in 2002 for telling the story. Remember that? Well, why wouldn't the FBI in DC give them a FISA warrant, let them go ask for their FISA warrant based on the fact that they knew that the French said that this guy and his brother are both recruiters for the jihad in Chechnya. That's your FISA warrant right there. But what did the FBI say? They said, no, we like the jihadists in Chechnya. They might be friends of Osama bin Laden, but when they're fighting the Russians, we like them and we don't consider them terrorists at all. So being an ally of Khattab, who is an ally of Osama, doesn't count. And it was based on that decision that September 11th happened a month later. That's your FBI. The FBI goes, well, I don't know. The CIA says those are our terrorists. So what are we supposed to do?
Wow. Very powerful stuff. And Scott, I really appreciate you providing us with these pieces of data from your research and your upcoming book. When can people expect to get a copy of your book available?
Oh man, I'm really sorry to say that it's still months away. I'm just writing it, and it's.
Do we have a title yet or not yet?
I'm sorry.
Do we have a title yet or not yet?
Yeah, yes, I have a title, and I already bought the barcode and everything, so nobody could steal my title, even though it's a very obvious one. Provoked: How America Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine.
Wow. Well, you better get out soon before it becomes a hot war.
I know, man. Seriously, I'm afraid he's going to get us in a nuclear war with China over Taiwan before I could publish my book about Russia. Things are moving so fast.
Well, Scott, I really appreciate your work. You're a voice of sanity in a sea of cowards and liars and psychopaths. So I appreciate you bringing this information to the American public. And I hope that change can be made quickly so that we can all actually exist in a planet without having catastrophe. So thank you.
Here. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that.